I'm presenting to you tonight a project that began as my DMA entrance essay, but it was for me actually a culmination of a number of interests that I was really thrilled to see come together in the way they did. Of course, I started out in my musical training, well, of course, started out on piano, but sang in choirs, took organ lessons starting in high school. I'm not that my story is unique there by any means in this crowd. And much later, after college, after grad school, got interested in early music, historical performance, harpsichord, and when it came time to decide what to write about for a DMA essay, after considering many possibilities, none of which seemed very exciting to me, it occurred to me this would be a way to bring all these interests of mine together: early music, organ, harpsichord. And I think this hits on an area that has not really been written about a lot, or at least historically has not been written about a lot. And that is that in Bach's music, there is a big influence from French dance. Now, maybe that was never news to you, but for me, that was a bit of a eureka moment some years ago. That I remember hearing a lot in music history about German church music shaping Bach and Italian influences shaping Bach and so forth. I don't remember hearing a lot about French influence, other than that he, of course, wrote dance suites. But as organists, we don't deal with dance suites. So this became a new area for me, again, at some time well after my college and grad school days. And so it might beg the question, at least it would have to me at once upon a time, how would Bach have become so familiar with French music? Bach didn't live in France, right? I mean, it was a long way. And there are some, I found, some pretty interesting reasons for that. Again, maybe you've always known this, and this is just me being slow. But so first, let me say a little bit about the dance culture that was that shaped all this. It, of course, beginning in France, and it started pretty much in the person of Louis XIV, who was an avid dancer himself. As well as being an aspiring great warrior and king and conqueror and whatnot, you wouldn't think dance would be a very manly endeavor for someone with such aspirations, and yet he was very much interested in dance. In fact, he seemed to believe that mastering dance was important to mastering body control in ways that applied directly to combat. We're thinking combat at this time, being fencing and whatnot. So there was a lot to dance that Louis XIV appreciated, and of course, lucky for us, for a dancer, music is very important. So under Louis's reign, not only did this culture of dance emerge and flourish, but also a culture of music around it. Now, how did that jump over to Germany? There, in the time that Bach was coming along, this was the era of after the 30 Years' War in that part of the world, what we now today know as Central Germany. And so there was this competition between the duchies in that region over who had rebuilt the best. And part of rebuilding meant who had developed a scene of high culture the best. And more, these duchies were looking to Paris for an example of what culture is like and what high culture is like. And so this love of dance that first flourished in France actually began to spread and reach very far-flung places throughout the European continent. Even far beyond Germany, as far as Russia and Scandinavia. So what I'd like to do first, I'm going to throw my tech guy off here because I'm going to ask him to play not the number 1 video, but the number 10 video for a bit. And what this is a scene from a Baroque opera. This is a production I had the honor of being part of in 2008 at the Amherst Early Music Festival. In fact, you might notice a significantly younger me right smack dab middle of the orchestra in the pit there in front of the stage. Pay no attention. But this is a scene from late in the opera, and it will give you a little bit of a feel, a little bit of a preview of what this dance and also gesture culture looked like a little bit. Now, this is not a professional performance. Amherst Early Music Festival Opera Project is all the roles are played by grad students, pre-professionals, and this is put together in a week's time. So it looks a little bit like they're kind of trying this on and not real natural with it yet, but it still gives you, I think, a pretty good idea. Let's listen. I hope some of the things you notice there is this dance ethos, this dance aesthetic is big on elegance, a sense of effortlessness, a lot of sense of almost like the dancers are floating a little bit. They're up on their toes a lot, and it almost is as if they're defying gravity a lot. This is not yet ballet. It's not nearly as athletic and advanced as that, but this is what later became that. And you may have also noticed there was quite a series of gestures with the arms. This was a big part of the aesthetic, and we have treatises that talk about how you do that. Not just if you're on stage, but like if you're an orator or what have you. This was considered a very important part of public presentation. And it was important that it looked graceful, that it looked elegant. This is very different aesthetic from what you might think of at, say, something like Vivaldi, which is much more about intensity and breaking a sweat and all that sort of stuff. The French ethos was much more about looking good, right? Effortless and looking good. Notice the arm gestures are never symmetrical because that was considered more natural looking. You can see this in art from the era and so forth. So this whole ethos emerges, and then it's picked up elsewhere across the continent because, again, by this point, Paris is considered the height of culture, and everyone is in a rush to emulate it. And this is happening in Germany, where Bach grew up, or at least where he went as a young adult, late teens, off to boarding school in Lüneburg, where he was at least according to Wikipedia, the St. Michael's School. But there was also another school there called the Ritter Academy, where many young boys, young men from very aristocratic backgrounds were sent to school. And many of the disciplines that they were studying were very much in this vein of looking to emulate things French. So, French literature, philosophy, fencing, and dance. Dance was a big part of their curriculum, and dance in this French courtly style. So while Bach was not a student at the Ritter Academy, he was very likely boarding with boys from this school and likely immersed in what they were studying. And also, we have evidence that he had occasion to travel with one of his teachers to a city whose name is going to escape me at the moment, I believe a bit south of Lüneburg, where the Duke had literally built a miniature Versailles as his estate house. So this appetite for all things French was huge. And it only grew in the years as Bach began moving into his career, so that by 1720s, 1730s, he's writing dance suites like crazy. In fact, there's a story about the 6 partitas, which are really 6 dance suites. So why did he call them 6 partitas? Well, that's a long story, and that's another discussion. But the point is, he was following his predecessor's footsteps in publishing a set of partitas, at least calling them partitas. His predecessors really were partitas. But by this time, the 1720s, 1730s, dance had become such a big thing that that's what Bach was writing, even when he was calling it partitas in some cases. So, also there's evidence that in the city of Leipzig, I forget which decade, but in the first half of the 18th century, between 1720 and 1730, or some 10-year period in there, the number of dance instructors registered in the city of Leipzig ballooned. I mean, this was huge. So where you might be tempted to ask the question, how would Bach have been exposed to French dance? Once you look into it, you really realize the question is, how could he have not been? It was everywhere. It was pervasive. So it stands to reason that if this is all around, it's going to impact his music, even his music that's not a dance by name. And what I'm going to do is take you through a few examples tonight of in the organ repertoire particularly, where I think that shows up. So I'm going to just go through a list of dances here and then show you an example of that dance in its native form, like by a French composer, and then an example of the same dance in Bach in one of the dance suites, and then an organ piece that seems to have at least very, very similar characteristics, to the point that you might be tempted to say, he was thinking about that dance when he wrote that. So let's try this. I'm going to start with a bourrée. That's B-O-U-R-E-E. Bourrée. A bourrée is a duple meter dance. And one of the things we have, and I'll be quoting throughout this, is several treatises from the time in which the writers of the treatises have tried to describe dances, these various dances, according to what effect they should have. And also things like what meter they're in and what kind of phrase structure they have, but then they also have a certain affect. Like the bourrée is described as having a happy rhythm, contented and pleasant and carefree. A bourrée should be contented, pleasant, and carefree. I forget which treatise that came from, but I'm drawing from treatises by, if you're wondering, Matheson, Walther, and Quantz. All treatises dating from the 1730s, 1740s. So let's hear this Bourrée by Lully, which comes from one of his opera comiques. So, duple meter, and very characteristic is that half-beat pickup, and 1 and 2, and 1 and 2. Typically, it will be written in cut time, sometimes 4/4, sometimes other meters, but most often cut time. Here's an example of a Bourrée by Bach from one of the English suites. So there again, duple meter with the half-beat pickup, and 1 and 2, and 1 and 2, and 1 and a 2. So what would you think now, knowing this about the Bourrée, if you were to come across a theme like this in the organ repertoire? Exactly the same rhythmic pattern, and 1 and 2 and 1. I believe this is a Bourrée. It fits the pattern perfectly. So, and I don't think that's a coincidence or an accident. I suspect Bach knew the Bourrée form very well, and he's going to that with this fugue. So, and by the way, if there are any questions at any point, Michael, my tech guy here, is looking for hands. So I'd be happy to entertain questions at any time. Can't promise I can answer them, but I'm happy to entertain them. So I'm going to move on from the Bourrée now to a different dance. So there is a dance called the Louré, L-O-U-R-E. The Louré is typically, it's a triple meter, typically something like 6/4, and has a dotted rhythm. Bum, ba-dum, bum, bum, ba-dum, bum. Some of you may be familiar with one of the many forms of the Gigue, another dance. That's G-I-G-U-E, sometimes J-I-G. That is a faster version of that rhythm. Bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum. So that sometimes you will find in 18th century literature the Louré referred to as a slow Gigue. But it has that same bum, ba-dum, bum. Here's an example. Again, I've reduced opera. I have a question?
Ed wants to know which organ Gigue that was.
Oh, that was the C minor BWV 537. If we have time at the end, I hope to have time to play that, but we'll see how time goes and what your appetite is for that by that time. So the Louré, 6/4 time usually. The treatise writers speak of the Louré as being slow and ceremonious. Now, slow is one of those relative terms, but probably slow relative to the Gigue. First note of each half measure is dotted, which should be well observed, Walther writes. Here's an example of a Louré from an opera by André Campra. So now, hear this. Bach didn't write many Bourrées that I'm aware of, but there is one from the so-called French suite in Gigue. Let's hear that. Awesome. Now, you remember I said slow is a relative term. You remember seeing those arm gestures in the dancers that we saw earlier and how sometimes they get quite florid. Those gestures, again, we have documentation. We have treatises that go through with diagrams how to do that. Was sometimes referred to in dance as embellishments. And so I think those 16th notes in the Bourée we just heard of Bach is an example in music of embellishments. The dance rhythm itself is slow, dum, ba dum, bum, but that doesn't mean it doesn't get these florid embellishments thrown in there, especially in Bach. So now I think we have an example in the organ repertoire of a Bourée. Isn't that rhythm? Bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum. It's the slow Gigue rhythm is there. And I think when you see the similarity, at least I do, I think I do, the similarities between that and the Bourée from the G major suite, it just doesn't seem like a stretch to me to think that that's where he's going. That's his go-to here. He's written for us, literally, for us organists, a Bourée. Remember I said earlier we don't deal with the dance music as organists, or at least not named dances, but I think it is in our repertoire, very much so. So that's the Bourée. Let's move on now to the Gigue. By the way, that was the prelude for the fugue that Ed was asking about earlier, 537, the Fantasy in C minor. So let's move on to the Gigue. So what do we know about the Gigue? There's actually quite a variety of types of Gigues. But the descriptions that the treatise writers give them pretty well apply to all. Triple meter, striving for haste, fleeting, somewhat like a brook rushing ahead. And we think of varieties like fast eighth notes, da-da-pa-pa-da-pa-pa-da-pa-pa, but then there are other varieties where the eighth note is not quite so fast, but then there are lots of sixteenths. Dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, ba-da-da-da-dum, ba-da, something like that. Or da-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da, maybe start with eighths and get busier later. So I've got a couple of Bach examples of Gigues. And they both come from the partitas. This is from the partita in D major, the Gigue. So all there, right? Triple meter, striving for haste. Yeah, I think so. Fleeting, somewhat like a brook rushing ahead. Sure felt that way when I played it. And another thing I would like to point out in that fugue subject was the use of silence in the middle of the subject. I'm sure you noticed. Let's get an 8-foot on here. Right? I'm not aware of French examples of Gigue's subjects doing that, but there are examples of Bach, including this one from the G major partita. Two examples of Bach. So the first was in 9/8, the second in 6/8. So compound meters, a bit of eighth notes, and then constant running 16th notes further in. Silence in the subject. So do you know which organ piece I may be going to? Sure you do. More silence. So forth, and I expect we know that one very well. But what could that be if not a Gigue? And it certainly fits the examples, particularly that G major example that we heard earlier. So much of that fits. So we have, this is not the so-called Gigue fugue in G that we have is not the only Gigue fugue that we have by Bach. This is, I think, a perfect example. Right, so that's the Gigue. Look at all these fun dances we have to play. So let's move on to, the Passepied. Passepied, I'll spell that. That's Passepied, Passepied. That's French for pass, literally means pass foot, which implies a quick motion with the foot, I believe. All right, so the treatise writers say about the Passepied. Triple meter, quite fast, playful, the author even says flirtatious, frivolous, and fickle. That's Matheson. So here's an example of a French Passepied. The composer is Gaspard Leroux. Right, so there it is, triple meter, quite fast, playful, flirtatious maybe. So let's hear this example. There are a few examples of Passepieds in Bach's dance suites, including this one from the English suite in E minor. So there we are, and yet again, quite fast, playful, and in the case of the Bach example there, you see we get more into flowing 16th notes. Da da dum bum ba da 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 da. So pretty quickly, Bach is in that texture of constant 16th notes, at least in one voice. So, you know where I'm going with this one? I think we may have a Passepied in our repertoire as well. Wonder who's guessing. Yeah, maybe. What do you think? The toccata in F major? Maybe is a Passepied. I don't know of many Italian cantatas that are in 3/8, so certainly seems to be there. Now here's what I think is an interesting thought. So we know that that probably one of the most famous elements of the toccata in F major is this, of course. Right. The pedal solo in 3/8 16th notes. Remember what Passepied means? Quick foot. You think? Maybe? I think maybe so. So that I add that to my case of we have dance music in our repertoire, and I don't think that's a stretch. I really don't think that's a stretch. We have dance music in our Bach organ repertoire. So let's move on now. If there aren't any questions, let's move on now to the courante. Now, if you remember from your music history, the courante is the second movement of a four-movement dance suite. The four sort of defaults in a dance suite, I'm sure you remember this: allemande, courante, sarabande, gigue. And then other dances might get in the mix elsewhere. But the gigue usually always finishes. So the courante is one of those default four dances, so to speak. There's a little bit of a complicated history in the courante. There's also the dance known as the corrente, which is a more Italianate, you might be tempted to say, cousin of the courante, although I'm not sure how intertwined their histories are. But there is, in the Baroque, quite a lot of examples of once you decide what defines a courante, and then this defines the corrente, you find examples of composers getting them reversed. So either they didn't agree, or they've freely interchanged the names. I don't know. Bach seemed to have a pretty good idea about which was which, but there are two things I think that defines these dances: the courante and the courante and the corrente. They're both triple meter. They are described as having a mood of sweet expectation. This is 18th century writers. Sweet expectation, longing, and gratifying. How do you play longing and gratifying? Well, there we are. So there's a characteristic of the courante is it tends to be being more French. Remember, French, we're very into elegant, right? Appearing effortless and natural. So the triple meter tended to be a bit more broad, a bit bit slower. Something like 1 and 2 and 3 and 1, with lots of hemiolas and back again. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1 and 2 and 3. In fact, one of the characteristics of French courants is that they're constantly playing with whether we're in the little 3 or the big 3 rhythm. And sometimes it's ambiguous. It's like they're having fun playing with that. I think they had fun with that in the same way that Renaissance composers, especially English Renaissance composers, had fun with those false melodic relations, you know, where you get F sharp in this part and F natural in this part at the same time. That wasn't a mistake. They loved that. And I think this was the case with this sort of ambiguity with rhythm in the French courant. And the Italian corrente tended to be a little more straightforward in rhythm, maybe occasional hemiola at a cadence or something like that. And you would tend to see more things like eighth notes running constantly. So 1, 2, 3, 1, and then maybe a few bars in, ba da 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 da, and off it goes running like that. Elegant running. Now the question becomes: do we have an example of a courant, corrente hybrid in the organ repertoire? Well, I'll come back to that in a minute. But first, I'd like to play for you. This is a Corelli corrente. So Italian composers were writing courants and correntes as well. From his suite, not suite, it would be probably sonata in D. I didn't write that down. But anyway, from his Opus 2, number 1, this is the corrente for a trio. Doesn't that make music just make you go, elegant, so elegant. So now, what meter was that in? Now, it was written in 3/4, but is it really? If you recall, that bass line had a lot of, so if this is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, the bass line had a lot of 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, right? So the 1, 2, 1 is an example of a big 3, right? 1, 2, 3, a hemiola. They're all over the place. These hemiolas are all over the place. So here, he's very much in the French mode here. He's got that, it's written as 3/4, but with that many hemiolas, it's like, why did he bother? Why didn't he just write it in 3/2? They're all over the place. So now let's look at an example in Bach of some similar things happening. So this is a fugue subject. I don't hear this one played very much, but maybe you know it. that is written in 3/4. 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Is that working okay, Mike, for me? Okay. So it's written in 3/4, but is it not possible that that's 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and it's one hymnal after another. Why didn't he write it in 3/2? Why didn't Corelli write it in 3/2? This is the fugue in A major. The sonata of Corelli we heard was in A major. Is it possible Bach knew that piece and was thinking about it when he wrote this fugue? I mean, maybe not, but gosh, that's a lot of coincidences, isn't it? So, and then later on, as this fugue develops, once the third voice comes in, let's see, that would start here. The texture starts to get a little busier. We start to get a bit snippets of a measure of all eighth notes in one of the voices. And then later on, it gets even busier. The bass line starts to cut loose when the soprano later has the subject, right here. Misspoke. I started where it was a false entry. The actual subject entry was a little later. But throughout all that, the left hand has this busy stuff. Very Corrente-like, right? Our Corelli example didn't point that out very well, but there are certainly others. So I think here again, I think we have a Corrente Courant hybrid by Bach in our organ repertory. So, if there are no questions, I'm going to move on to one more dance, which you might have thought would be the most obvious, and that is the Passepied I. The Passepied I in C minor that we know well as organists, it may be that it actually wasn't an organ piece originally. We tend to adopt pieces, keyboard pieces that Bach wrote. We as organists tend to adopt pieces that Bach wrote that use pedals. But we have to remember the organ was not the only keyboard instrument with pedals. And there is some speculation by Bach scholars that the Passepied I, along with the trio sonatas, may not have actually been intended as organ pieces. But we've adopted it, and we play it, and we do have an early manuscript that says organo pleno for the Passepied I. So if maybe taking it to the organ happened pretty early on. So we claim it, and I'm happy with that. The Passepied I is also very closely similar to another dance, as you probably well know, called the chaconne. In fact, it's a very complicated discussion about what's the difference between a Passepied I and chaconne. And composers at the time don't seem to agree which definition applies to which. And in fact, I've seen one example of a piece which the title is Passepied I or chaconne. That's a Louis Couperin, Passepied I or chaconne, from one of his keyboard pieces sets. So it's almost splitting hairs to get into, at least in this context, splitting hairs to get into what's the difference between the two. Pardon me, my monitor's running on low battery. So I'm just going to turn it off. But one of the things that these is definitely applies to these forms, these dances, and they were dances, Passepied I's and chaconnes, is triple meter, and as you know, a bass theme, 4 bars, 8 bars long, that repeats. And the music, over each repetition of that bass theme, the music going on above the bass line changes up, right? So I'm going to take us back to that first example we heard. This is from the opera Ariadne by a German composer named Joseph Conradi. This is an opera that was premiered in Hamburg in the 1730s, I believe, performed at Amherst Early Music Festival in 2008. So I don't know how well we can pick it up roughly where we stopped it. Maybe they can hear a bit more of that. But this is an example of a chaconne or passecaille. All right, so I trust you can hear the chaconne theme. It's just a 4-note bass theme and constant variation over it. So orchestral ritornello during the next few strains it's one of the characters on stage singing a verse, another orchestral bit. So a couple of things I think to point out there. This, by the way, is the point in the show, and this is a chaconne was a pretty common way for a French opera to end. That bass theme sort of acts as like an engine, right? It's what drives the music. It's kind of like the drive shaft of a car. You know, it's the fact that it's doing the same thing isn't a cause to be bored with it. It's like if it didn't do that, something would be wrong, right? And the interest comes from the variety of what's going on around it. Yes, right. And I think by the way, at that point in the show is at the end or near the end. I think there's one more chorus that follows it, but this is like the final ensemble number where everybody comes out on stage and takes their turn singing about how lovely it is that the lovers have passed through their angstful trials and come together and all is well, right? It's the happy ending. And I think this is going to be familiar to many of you. Now I'm going to play another example of a passecaille by a French composer. And you know where I'm going with this, I suspect. This is the Trio a Passepied from the Kyrie portion of André Raisson's organ book from 1688. Trio a Passepied. So, Trio a Passepied by André Raisson, so as in trio in the manner of a Passepied. And we recognize that theme, of course, don't we? So, as we know, the Bach's Passepied is that very same theme. Did he know this piece by Raisson? Seems possible. Or is this taken from a theme that would have been known by the both of them through some other means? For whatever reason, Bach's Passepied starts with that exact same theme. And so now what I'm going to try to do is to apply that sort of, that ethos of Passepied, right? That bass line that is sort of the engine to what goes on around it, and try to apply that to the Passepied of Bach. A bit of Bach's Passepied. So forth. All right, so I think that seems to be, I think that works. I think in particular in that when the manuals first come in with that offbeat entrance, I think a Passepied theme with that kind of momentum behind it works quite well. And again, the interest is not in, I think, so much in the scheme of, say, the sort of bolero-esque crescendo from start to finish, but in the variety that comes around, in the manner that we heard in that Ariadne excerpt. Right, and it becomes a bit more of a virtuosic piece, and I think the fact that there's 21 iterations of the bass line doesn't feel quite so drawn out. So I suspect, at least to my senses, that looking at the Passepied of the Baroque period and other examples of it is somewhat informative here as a possible take with the piece. So so that's generally my presentation right there. I think when we look at repertoire at the time and understand just how big French dance was to Bach's world, we can't deny that he was immersed in it, and it had to show up. It had to show up somehow in his repertoire. So I don't know how we're doing on time. 8:30, okay. All right, so right at an hour, hey. In time for a late dinner. So I don't know if there are any questions that would like to throw at me. If time permits, I would be delighted to present that C minor Fantasy and Fugue that I played snippets of earlier, the whole pieces, if you'd like to hear that. Like to hear these principles I've been talking about, at least an attempt to apply them throughout a piece. My monitor is dying, so if there's anything that I need to see or hear.
There's a question about, do you see the Goldberg variations as dance movements?
Do I see the Goldberg variations as dance music? Some of them. There's definitely a Gigue in there. I think it expressly says so. I haven't looked at that one in a while, but I'm sure there are other examples. I think there's a Polonaise. And I think in many cases he indicates so. But that one's not fresh on my mind. But there's definitely examples there. I wouldn't be hesitant at all to stick my neck out on that one. Anything else? Or would we like to hear a Fantasy and Fugue?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the Fantasy and Fugue. Got to switch out my Neue Bach Ausgabe here. The Neue Bach Ausgabe, which is not so neue. So, quick reminder, I am arguing that the Fantasia is a Bourée. Remember the slow Gigue? Well, if I don't make a mess of it. Bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum. And the fugue, I am arguing, is a Bourée. And 1 and 2, and 1 and 2. By the way, I forgot to mention earlier 2 other examples of Bourrées in the Bach repertoire. There's this one. Yeah? And 1 and 2, and 1 and 2. Now, that one isn't barred in 2-2 and with an eighth note pickup, but the rhythm is there. There's also this one. Same thing. And 1 and 2, and 1 and 2, and 1. And that one is in cut time. So that's 4 eighth notes, right? So that's half the bar. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. So there we are. We've got lots of Bourrées to pick from. So anyway, Fantasy and Fugue, which is really, I think, a Bourée and Bourée. Thank you very much. It has been lovely to be with you all this evening. Lovely to see you all, and really appreciate this opportunity. It's been great being in touch with Kathy over the months, however long that's been since we were first in touch. And I sure hope I had the opportunity to meet you in person sometime. This has been great. Thank you.